In the waning days of autumn 1942, 1,000,000 tons of shipping was proceeding silently on the Atlantic toward Gibraltar, bearing 107,000 British and American fighting men, some well-trained, others not, for the invasion of North Africa. This was the greatest armada to sail into battle in the history of the world. Yet the enemy did not realize what was about to happen until it became an accomplished fact. The invasion was split into 3 groups. The Western Task Force sailed from the U.S. bound for Casablanca. The Center and Eastern forces left from the British Isles and headed for Oran and Algiers. Virtually all the American troops aboard the transports were going into action for the first time. Just a few months earlier, these men had been clerks, garage mechanics, business executives, salesmen, lawyers, and factory workers. Now, only a few days away, they must be prepared to face the overwhelming demands of battle for the first time. Most of the men were making the adjustment successfully. When the ships were several days out at sea, the troops were briefed on where they would land and taught basic phrases of the languages spoken there. Instruction in French was supplemented by lessons in elementary Arabic during the long hours of waiting. Infantrymen worked endlessly on preparing their weapons, on which their lives might depend for the day of invasion. En route, they learned more about their assignment.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African Army will contest our landing, but all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally. Remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
Behind our first military offensive against the Nazis stood American industrial production, now geared to full wartime output. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General Brehon Somervell, Chief of the Army's Services of Supply, the nation had succeeded, during the years since Pearl Harbor, in converting from a peacetime to a wartime economy. General Somervell's branch of the Army was to play just as vital a part in the winning of the war as any combat unit. Among the millions who helped to do the job General Somervell directed was Dick Millett, a railroad engineer for the past 20 years.
We spent a lot of time in the cab in those days, but we knew that if we slowed up on the job, it meant that the men at the front wouldn't have all the equipment and supplies they needed. As fast as the stuff rolled off the production lines, we hauled it to the East Coast.
The nation's railroads succeeded in winning the crucial battle of transportation by handling unprecedented quantities of supplies with maximum efficiency. A sizable percentage of American industrial corporations quickly converted to the production of equipment vital to the winning of the war. From the standpoint of production, 1942 was a year of miracles. Most war industries showed great increases in volume output. United in the common cause, the American people in every part of the country forgot political and economic differences and worked as they never had before to make our victory on the battlefields possible. During 1942, the war workers of the United States produced 48,000 military planes of all types, more than the total production of planes by Germany, Italy, and Japan combined for that year. During that year, too, the U.S. produced some 56,000 combat vehicles, such as tanks and self-propelled artillery, key weapons in modern mechanized war. Large-scale invasions like the North African campaign had their birth many months before contact with the enemy was made. The success of Operation Torch depended directly on the round-the-clock job of millions of conscientious American war workers who produced the vast quantities of the machinery of war needed before the campaign could even be planned. The roadbeds of every railroad line in the country were in constant use. Freight and flat cars, which in peacetime would have been scrapped and replaced, were pressed into service to help transport the vital materiel from war plants in all parts of the country, thousands of miles eastward, to the great port cities on the Atlantic seaboard. At the ports of embarkation, cargo ships were loaded with every item necessary to keeping an enormous army in good health, in good spirits, and well equipped for battle on any terrain. Supplies arrived on the East Coast faster than they could be transshipped overseas, and vast stockpiles soon filled warehouses in eastern port cities to overflowing. As the U.S. approached the end of its first year at war, American industry was successfully meeting the tremendous challenge of the battle of supply. The most critical problem in keeping the flow of supplies moving to our troops overseas was the serious shortage of ships. In November of 1942, the tonnage of Allied shipping sunk by enemy action exceeded the tonnage in the construction of new ships. For the invasion of North Africa, scores of cargo ships were loaded day and night at American ports with the machines of war to be used shortly against the enemy. Slowly, our first offensive against the Nazis was gathering momentum. All three task forces involved in the North African invasion, two from the British Isles and one from the United States, proceeded to the points of attack in complete secrecy. Allied commanders considered it remarkable that the enemy, with all its U-boats, did not detect the presence of three massive forces all converging near Gibraltar. Right up to the day of the landings, our tactics were never clearly interpreted by the enemy. Something was in the wind, the Nazis realized, but they had no idea what, until our ships were in position for the assault. The orders called for all three task forces to arrive off the points of attack simultaneously. For the troops, H hour was to be approximately the same in all three landings in the early morning of November 8th. The Eastern Force, scheduled to land at Algiers, was composed of both British and American ships and carried 33,000 invasion troops, 10,000 American, and the other 23,000 British. All the warships in the two Mediterranean forces were British. The Center Task Force, with American transports, carried 39,000 American troops who were to land in the Oran area. In the early morning of November 8th, Allied naval units engaged the French. Off Algiers, the Eastern Task Force arrived on schedule, and the troops prepared to go ashore. No one was sure of exactly what the French garrison ashore would do by way of opposing the landing. For 16 hours during the first day, Allied troops poured ashore by the thousands. After feeble resistance by the confused French defenders, who did not understand at first which country's troops were landing, firing ceased on the evening of the first day. The area was quickly occupied by our forces.
The Oran assault involved the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and parts of the U.S. 1st Armored Division.
In addition, 500 American paratroopers were flown from the British Isles and dropped near the airfield south of Oran. By a miscalculation, some were dropped over the wrong area. Unfortunately, the mission was unsuccessful. At Oran, the landings were a different story. For the invasion of Oran, American troops had been decided upon. For the Allied High Command felt that the French, stationed in and near Oran, would bitterly resist the British after the Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet there. The plan called for one combat group to land to the east of the city and another force to the west of Oran. Then both were to converge and capture the city by a double envelopment. After the naval engagement in Oran Harbor, the troops started ashore in the early morning of November 8th. Some 200 miles east, the invasion of Algiers was beginning. And to the west, on the Atlantic coast, the assault at Casablanca was getting started. Although some of the assault waves were delayed in starting ashore, the landings on both flanks of Oran went off smoothly. Some units landed unopposed. Others encountered stiff resistance. The final assault, aimed at taking all of Oran, had been scheduled for noon on November 10th. But the surrender of the French at that time ended the fighting, and the city itself was occupied by American forces. The Allies now controlled 2 of the chief Mediterranean ports in French North Africa. With the surrender, thousands of French troops who had fought conscientiously under the orders of their Vichy-controlled commanders lay down their arms. The second part of the 3-pronged invasion of North Africa was successfully accomplished. The third and most difficult landing was scheduled on the Atlantic coast of French Morocco, north and south of Casablanca. The All-American Western Task Force stood offshore late on the evening of November 7th and was fired on early the next morning by elements of the French fleet. The naval battle raged off the coast all that day, with 4 of the French ships finally sunk and the remainder put to rout. Meanwhile, the troops were encountering heavy opposition ashore, notably at Port Lyautey, north of Casablanca. After 4 days of fierce fighting, the French received orders to cease firing. American and British units, which had participated in the 3 landings, now battle-tested, moved forward at once toward the British 8th Army more than 1,200 miles away. In between were the Nazis. Once Allied troops were safely ashore in North Africa, our commanders wanted to move out to meet the Nazis with all possible speed before they could bring reinforcements across the Mediterranean. But the big problem was not a simple military one. Complicating the forward movement of our troops was the baffling French political situation. The people were greatly influenced by Marshal Pétain, World War I hero of the Battle of Verdun, and aging premier of the Hitler-dominated Vichy government. But to General Henri Giraud, whom the Allied High Command counted on heavily to swing the North African French over to the Allied cause, they paid little attention. In every case, after the successful landings had been made, Allied commanders tried to negotiate with French military leaders for a permanent peace agreement. But center of attention was Vichyite Jean Delin, the key to a possible solution to our North African problem. Meanwhile, General Eisenhower's forces had already started their drive to the east to meet the British Desert Army, 1,200 miles away at the other end of North Africa. The plan was to catch the German Afrika Korps in a giant vice and then crush it from both sides. Hastily from across the Mediterranean, the Nazis were bringing reinforcements to Tunis to strengthen the German armies under the overall command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in preparation for the showdown battle for Tunis, which was then forming. The success of the Allied military offensive depended to a considerable extent on whether an agreement was reached with Darlan and the French political muddle resolved. If not, the Allies faced a possible open break with the North African French military forces, which consisted of some 200,000 French and colonial troops. The French Air Force in North Africa had a strength of several hundred planes, which could quickly go into action against us if no agreement were reached, and greatly retard our drive eastward toward the Nazis. When the Allies finally settled with Darlan, correspondents in Algiers were confronted with the problem of trying to explain the puzzling situation and still obey military security. The delicate pattern of our relations with Darlan was carefully described to the American people. But to many Americans, the news from North Africa was confusing and irritating. But the union with Darlan in North Africa achieved for the Allies a permanent peace with the French there. In the Allied forward area on Christmas Day 1942, General Eisenhower had dinner on a road as he returned from Souk al-Khamis, British 5th Corps headquarters. His visit had a heartening effect. That same day, General Eisenhower headed back to Algiers for the funeral of Admiral Darlan, who had been assassinated the evening before by a French youth. But complicated as the political situation in French North Africa remained, at least the French military forces were no longer fighting against us. French troops were now allied with British and American units. In the African theater, French soldiers saw considerable action, fighting now on our side. In a bold attempt to try to reach Tunis before the Nazis could further reinforce their position there, the British First Army continued its punishing drive without let-up.
Set 10-600!
The Allied offensive was stalled until the weather broke. For the troops, already exhausted by the weeks of bitter fighting since the invasion began, the rest was welcome, but not exactly pleasant. Every day they seemed to sink still further into the mud. In the midst of the gloom at the front in January of 1943, came the electrifying news that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were meeting at Casablanca. Greatly elated by the occasion were the troops in the vicinity, as well as the high commanders of the Allied armies and navies. The President's concern with the serious war problems still facing the Allies was offset by the obvious thrill he experienced from the visit. Some of the units then in the area enthusiastically filed past the President's reviewing post in an atmosphere charged with excitement. A few surprised GIs who had already distinguished themselves in the battle for North Africa during the few weeks just past had the happy honor of being decorated personally by their commander-in-chief. Another notable meeting brought de Gaulle and Giraud together. At the conference, the meeting of the combined chiefs of staff proclaimed in ringing terms our policy for the pursuit of the war against the Axis. A number of specific military policy matters were also settled. Generals Eisenhower and Alexander were to work together closely throughout the decisive final phase of the North African campaign. For 6 weeks, the Allied advance had been stalled in the heavy mud. Reinforcements were brought up, and our battle line organized in preparation for the planned assault designed to bottle the Nazis up in Tunisia. The enemy, too, was preparing for the showdown battle. Some of the forces under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, were reassigned to the north to bolster the positions of Von Arnhem there. Meantime, Rommel was fighting a strong delaying action against the British Eighth Army. Forcing Rommel's Africa Corps to retreat steadily were General Sir Bernard Montgomery's forces. On the other side, the Nazis were being pressed back by the Allied forces which had made the landings in French North Africa 3 months earlier. In the winter of 1943, Generals Alexander and Anderson completed discussions of the details for the beginning of our new all-out drive toward Tunis in a final thrust to wipe the enemy off the African continent. The Allied intelligence about a heavy enemy attack was accurate. The Nazi forces massed their mechanized equipment, which led the advance, supported by infantry units. The last frantic German drive to keep all of North Africa from falling to the Allies was on. The Germans attacked in force, but not at the point where the Allies expected it. At Faid and at Gatza, the enemy launched a heavy two-pronged assault, with both forces converging at Kasserine, at the base of the now famous Kasserine Pass. The Allies were caught flat-footed. The battle at Kasserine Pass was one of the worst setbacks the Allies had suffered so far. As the final drive started, Allied superiority in the air was growing steadily. The enemy was driven to cover. The big push was on. The Germans were putting up a stubborn fight, but the American Second Corps and the British First Army proved too much for them. The battle for Tunis was entering its final phase. The enemy was thoroughly beaten, but continued to try to stop our rapid advance toward Tunis and complete victory, now virtually within our grasp. The British Tommies had the Nazis' Desert Fox almost at bay. Montgomery's men were eager for the kill. For 5 months, the army of the crafty Rommel had been under attack by the British Eighth Army, which had zigzagged across North Africa. Now, after El Alamein, Tobruk, Benghazi, and Tripoli, the enemy was finally ground down by the wiry Eighth Army Tommies.
Fire!
The Afrika Korps did not give up easily. For 9 days, the Nazis fought back doggedly before the Battle of Marath became another notable Allied victory. On through Tunisia, the Allies rolled toward final triumph in Africa. It had been a tough, bloody campaign, and the taste of victory was sweet to the men who had fought for so long to achieve it. After 5 months of the most bitter fighting, early in April, the Americans of the Second Corps met the Tommies of Montgomery's 8th Army. Once separated by 1,200 miles, the American Second Corps and the British 8th Army now faced the Nazis as a single, overpowering fighting force. On each side, the troops and the commanders had looked forward to this happy meeting for many discouraging months. This was a day to be remembered. But final victory was not yet ours. The enemy was still entrenched in positions on the hills to the north and had to be gradually routed out. The job at Hill 609 fell to the Americans of the Second Corps. The liberation of the Tunisian towns followed the same pattern that was to be repeated over and over in the campaigns on the European continent. Patrols were still seeking out enemy soldiers among the ruins. The German soldier in defeat presented quite a different appearance than the German soldier in victory. In World War II, the Nazi high command early instilled an arrogance that was usually missing after their capture. Misled by the Führer's assurances that the Wehrmacht was invincible, many of the captured Nazi soldiers seemed sadly disillusioned. Their dream of world conquest that had grown to enormous proportions since September 1939 was suddenly over. Stripped of the mantle of conqueror, the Nazi soldier was ill-prepared psychologically for the role of the vanquished. These were the supermen, the elite of the master race. Their path of victory, begun so triumphantly in Berlin nearly 4 years earlier, had come to a sorry end in Tunis. Beaten and bedraggled, they wore the face of every people who have tried to conquer the world and impose their will on others. The Nazi world conquerors ended up like all the rest. Caught in the giant Allied squeeze, the Nazis were wiped right off the African continent. The victory was officially ours on May 13th, 1943, and the once feared Afrika Korps no longer existed.
Adolf Hitler once had a great army which he called the Afrika Korps. It was commanded by General Erwin Rommel, who came to be known as the Desert Fox. Today, the brood of the fox has been utterly destroyed. Every member of that army, as well as every member of von Arman's army that Hitler sent into Africa to support Rommel, is either dead or has been captured. This great victory stands as a monument to the perfection of cooperation among the fighting services of the Allied nations in this theater. You would be proud of the way the British and French have fought here so magnificently. I know you would be proud of the way our own boys, your husbands, brothers, sons, and sweethearts, have delivered here for you.
Although busily engaged in preparations for an invasion across the Mediterranean, the Allies took time off to hold a victory parade in Tunis on May 20th, marking the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. victory won in Africa, General Eisenhower departed for Malta several weeks later to begin intensive planning for the operation which would constitute our first blow against the Nazis on European soil.